All right, welcome to my Info 362 portfolio video explaining my final infographic. First, I wanted to go over the models that I've been using throughout the quarter that I've been emulating. So we'll start with my color model. Here's my color model from Information is Beautiful on the effects of meditation. Here's a pretty good example of the color palettes I've been using with the green, brown, orange, and blue, as well as this gray, and then clearly this is on a white background. Moving on, we have my typography model as well as my visual language model. That can be seen here. So my typography model here, it's using DIN condensed bold as the typeface for this main title, and then Consolas is the closest typeface that I found for these smaller labels. In terms of typography, those are pretty much the only two typefaces that are used throughout this infographic. The other thing with typography here is that the sizing of the text varies within labels as well as for different labels. For example, with this numeric display, or just with this number rather, and this word here, the sizes vary, as well as the text or the typeface changes. And then in terms of visual language, this sort of labeling pattern I've used a lot in my infographic, and in this labeling as well with numbers. Yeah, I'll talk about the different types of visual language that I use from this model as well later on once I'm actually demonstrating my infographic. And then lastly, the layout models that I have are these two down here. I'm primarily emulating this infographic for my layout model, but I've also drawn some elements from this infographic as well for my layout model. Now let's actually get into my infographic. So here's my final infographic. My topic is coconuts, and my little tagline here, nature's most versatile drupe, the coconut. Let's go ahead and talk about each form of visual potential that I've exploited. So we'll start just up at the top here. So this display is exploiting the visual potential of the relationships. So coconuts are used in many different ways, and their uses overlap with each other in terms of the categories of uses. So there's 4 different categories: nutritional, cosmetic, religious, and industrial. And I've exploited their relationship with each other by creating a Venn diagram. Here, the Venn diagram is actually sort of unique because rather than using circles, I've used triangles, like the ones that are used in my color model. I thought this would be a unique approach for a Venn diagram, as well as a good way for me to better emulate my color model, not only using the same colors but also using the same shapes, even though shapes are sort of more of a visual language element. I thought that it was sort of an interesting and unique way to emulate my color model. I've continued to emulate my visual language model as well as my typography model by using the same typeface and using the same labeling techniques. This sort of title is representative of the same titling used in my visual language model. And then lastly, even though that the religious uses of coconut don't particularly overlap with the other uses of coconut, I thought that their relationship to coconut in general would be the most effective, or not the most effective, but would be important to include, because even though there is no overlap, it still shows the relationship to coconuts and all their other uses. Let's see. So yeah, this color scheme is monochromatic. It uses a variety of different colors. And yeah, I've also used alignment in this display with centering all of these texts, aligning this text, and then also equally spacing this text apart from the left, centering this text, centering or aligning these texts from the right, and then centering with this text as well. And I've also exploited the visual potential of appearance in this display. This silhouette or icon of a coconut is something that I created and exploits the visual potential of appearance of a coconut because it directly triggers the association of a coconut when it is seen. And colors are not used to encode or highlight in this case. However, I believe that you could argue that they're used to trigger associations. I think that the different colors I've chosen here from my color palette and color swatches could be representative of the actual categories that these coconuts different uses of coconut are used for. All right, moving on to my location display. My location display here is showing the average coconut production from 1961 to 2014, and the legend here shows the color encodings for each amount of tons of coconuts produced in that given country. So blue is encoded to over 1,150,000 tons of coconuts, green for over a million, yellow for over 150,000, orange for over 50,000, and gray for less than 50,000. I've also included in this display the top 5 producers of coconuts in 2013 specifically, just to give some context and to really highlight the extreme differences in these top 5 producing countries. So this display particularly exploits the visual potential of location by displaying a map, and a map of the world specifically, and each country is either a certain color where it's gray. Basically, the majority of the map is gray, which means that they produce less than 50,000 coconuts, which can almost mean that they don't produce any at all because it's not a significant amount. And then every other color represents the degree to which they produce coconuts. And this is sort of also supposed to trigger an association with these colors. So the blue is sort of supposed to trigger an association with health, fruitfulness, lots of coconuts, a sort of rich hydration of coconuts, you could say. And then the next green is sort of like healthy with lots of land, could trigger an association there as well. I've continued to emulate my color model by using the same color palette as before. I've emulated my visual language model by using the same labeling technique, like I said I would point out that I did earlier, by using this sort of half circle along with the full sort of capsule shape. These labels throughout the infographic have specific numbers with them too, so these are sort of exploiting the visual potential of numbers as well, even though it's just a textual representation of the number. Next, so I'm using the same typography and fonts from my typography model as well. This is DIN condensed bold, and then this also is sort of the same titling technique using DIN condensed bold as well. And DIN condensed bold is used in the labels in my visual language and typography model as well. These labels are precision labels. They are precisely labeling exactly what they are associated next to. Each label corresponds to its country specifically. What else? That's about it on this display. We can move on now. So here's one of my first numbers displays. Let me just center it here. There we go. So this is my first numbers display. This is displaying the metric tons of coconut water that is imported into the United States since 2004 to 2012. So this is a bar chart where every coconut water bottle represents 10,000 metric tons of coconut water. And the main intent of this display is to show how the number or the amount of coconut water that's imported into the US has greatly increased over the past 10 years. I have basically encoded here this coconut water bottle to 10,000 metric tons. So that's a visual encoding. It's sort of a color encoding, even though it's more of an iconic encoding. My sources are also included in this page. I've used alignment in this display to effectively align the bars of coconut water bottles with the year that they're associated with. And I've also aligned them horizontally so that they look collected and organized. Not only that, I've also aligned these labels such that each double label is protruding from the coconut water bottle in the same fashion as the original one, or as the other ones rather. I've used the same labeling technique of precision labeling for each year, and these labels directly emulate that of my visual language model. And these labels are meant to provide context for each for the years as they move forward. There's another display that I'll talk about next that also talks about different coconut water distributors and companies, and so I'll talk about those in a little bit. I've continued to emulate my typography model by using the same typeface as DIN condensed bold. Unfortunately, in my visual language model, there isn't a bar chart specifically, so I had to come up with my own method of visualizing numeric information in this way. And then I've also continued to emulate my typography and visual language model by having the same titling method. I use text to annotate here basically, so this is labeling as well as annotating. So the text is annotating each year, but it's also a precision label for that year specifically. The color I'm using in this display is not particularly of significance. The gray is meant to sort of blend into the background and not be too significant because we don't need to draw attention to the actual axes. So that's why I've added more color to the actual numbers so that the user's attention is drawn there more rapidly. However, the color is not used to encode, highlight, or trigger associations in this setting. It's merely meant to set a tone of informational and providing information to the user. But overall, since this is a numeric display, I feel as though I've exploited the visual potential of numbers in this display effectively because of the stark contrast in comparing the 2011 and 2012 years with the more latter years, because it's as people, we are most easily able to compare bars as we are other shapes. And so here in this context, I've exploited that potential of comparison of the bars most effectively, I feel. Moving on to my second numbers display. Let me just get it centered here, sorry. Here, so this is my second numbers display, different nut oil fat percentages. So this display is showing all of the different, or not all, but a good amount of different nuts that can be produced into oil and how their fat composition compares to that of coconut oil. So coconut oil is one of the other main or primary uses of coconut, and so I thought that having a display specifically about coconut oil would be important, given since it's such a big topic of coconuts. I've used text to annotate this primary piece of the display, the piece that is displaying the coconut oil's composition. Studies show that coconut oil's high saturated fat percentage contributes to many of its health benefits. This is just a brief, excuse me. This is a brief description of why coconut oil's health benefits are so high. It's because it has so much saturated fat. Next up, I have included a legend here, similar to that of my visual language model. Even though it's not specifically used as a legend, I thought that using the same sort of style would be an effective way to convey or to emulate my visual language model. So I've used the different colors here to encode to percent of monounsaturated fat, percent of polyunsaturated fat, and percentage of saturated fat. So for orange, green, and blue respectively. And then I've ordered or sorted this display based on the saturated fat, since coconut oil's saturated fat is what we're most interested in, and less for all of the other fats included on this, or oils, sorry, oils included on this display. I've continued to emulate my visual language model by using this labeling technique to, or I guess not really labeling, more indicators. And then I've also emulated my typography model by using the same typeface, didn't condense bold, and the same titling method. I've used alignment, I think, very effectively in this display, where I have all of the oils aligned to the left and they're right justified, and all of the different percentage bars within this infographic collected and aligned throughout, where the blue saturated fat bars are aligned to the right, and the orange monounsaturated fat bars are aligned to the left. And then green is centered, or just scattered rather, throughout the middle. And then this display, I also think, exhibits visual hierarchy by sorting the percent saturated fat. I think that I've drawn more attention to this piece of the infographic more, and so people's attention is drawn there more, especially with the blue in this indicator and the orange in this indicator. I think that the users are drawn more immediately to these sides of the display rather than just the entire thing all at once. Yeah. So that's about it for that display. And then here's my final display in this infographic, is my display that exploits the visual potential of time. So here I've created a timeline of coconut water distributors' founding years. So basically, with this display, I'm trying to convey to the reader or viewer how coconut water has been distributed since the 1970s. However, in the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen a lot more growth of coconut water companies and a lot more start to sprout up. This display also works in conjunction with my first numeric display that has data about different companies launching, and sort of to provide some context for other later purchases, mergers, and acquisitions of other companies later on too. So there's some unity and consistency across my displays. And then this display exploits the visual potential of time specifically by pointing out the different years that these companies were founded. I continue the same labeling technique as seen in my visual language model. I've used alignment to align the different companies' logos horizontally, and I've aligned the labels horizontally as well. And then I've also aligned the actual circles that have the years in them, and then vertically aligned the two that are the same. I haven't specifically used any color encodings here. I've more just used color to separate different aspects of this display. The colors are consistent throughout though. Orange for all of the time displays, green to sort of show the flow of time throughout. And then this is sort of where my color model is actually not completely utilized, because since I have these other icons or logos of these companies being used, their colors don't necessarily fit into the color palette that I've chosen. Let's see, next up, that's just about it for my time display. And then let's just take a final look at my total infographic again. We can see here sort of how I've used alignment. I'd like to talk about the layout or alignment first, then I'll talk about the layout. So I've aligned these titles vertically, and I've also aligned these titles left justified and these titles to the top justified. I intentionally left extra space here in order to draw attention to the main title, and then have people or have the viewer look more at this relationship display first, since it is the most color intense. My intent is for the viewer to view this first, this display first, since my title sort of leads you to believe that there are lots of different uses of coconut. This is the first thing I would like you to look at. And then the information flow can either flow to the right and down and left, or left and then down from the top on the rightmost column. I've sort of emulated both of my layout models by having one main element in the top left as the duck model does, and then I've included sort of different equally spaced sections around the main left element as my superhero layout does in its layout model. And then lastly, some points about unity and variety. I think that I've created unity throughout my entire infographic by using the same titling method, consistent colors throughout, consistent typeface throughout, and consistent dotted lines. I feel like these dotted lines provide unity to the infographic as well, since they are all the same. And then I've created variety in the logos here. The logos in this time display are unique and different, as well as the coconut water bottles. I feel as though they are varied and they're sort of unique to the infographic. And then one last thing about color is I think that I chose these colors very intentionally. I feel as though they sort of they trigger the association of a coconut. They have the the brown, it's an actual coconut. The green is sort of life and trees and plants. The blue is like coconut water, hydration, refreshing. And then the orange is just sort of a color you might associate with tropics or tropicalness, which is what you might associate with a coconut. And then last up, one last thing about layout is I've sort of strayed from my layout models since I've taken elements from both of them. So that is probably where my infographic is the most different from my models. It would be the most different from my layout models since it strays so much from both of them individually, but collectively draws from both of them. All right, that's it. Thank you for watching and learning about coconuts. I hope you learned something, and I'll talk to you next time.